Well, here we are for another week, Paul. Welcome everybody to tonight's Truth Proof live stream, and we are live from East Yorkshire. So good evening to you, Paul.
Evening, Les. I'm back again. Yeah, I've got a fan going here because it's absolutely roasting in this little room. I don't know about where you are.
If I could peel a roof off, that still would be too warm, I'm sure.
Yeah, and as you know, like obviously tonight we've got two people on that we've had on before, but never together, and they're going to sort of give us some information about the new book they've been working on together jointly, and other things that I think Philip and Irene will be better discussing than us introducing it here. So it's been a great week. There's been a bit of activity on coast again, which is good. I mean, we know it goes in fits and starts. So we had that incredible account from that fisherman who we're really grateful to on August 27th.
Yeah.
In between times, I've had a flurry of reports come in. Guess what? All from a similar area.
Really?
And one last night. So as it happened last night, I mean, I rang Pete up and we were up there at 10 o'clock last night because we'd got reports of it happening last night. Did we see anything? Zilch. Nothing. But we were still up there. We're up there till late, just with opportunity. You've got to do it. You've got to be in it to win it.
Yeah, that's it. And I'm just noticing everybody who's in the chat tonight. Props if we can just go through a few people who are in the chat, Paul.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I'm going to miss names here because I'm limited to what I can see. But we've got Sky doing moderating. Thank you very much. I've got Mary Sinclair in, so that's good. My wife, Barbara Davis, disabled Welshman, sober Carper, Dave Bancroft. Hi, Dave. Paul Hadley, Tetrastatic. That's an interesting name, isn't it? Yeah. I Talk Cryptids. Great lad. I met you at Awakening, and lovely to meet you. UFO nuts. I think we're all about like that. See, Andy Decodes is in. Fred Flintstone, Matthew Russell, Ronald Booth, Steve 071, and that's about Ralph Winter. I know there's going to the Revenant. Yeah. Oh yeah, well, it's always good to see him.
And our friend Joel's in as well.
Joel, great to see you, mate. We will be in touch probably this coming week, and I don't know if Lynn is in, and another few names. Obviously, with Glenn Ross and loads of people that I recognise. But great, thanks for support. Pat Adams, Wright. Paul Hadley. I'm going to have to stop because we could go on all night just reading names out. It's like a bingo.
Okay, so I think without further ado, then we'll bring your guests on, Paul, and I'll see you in a bit, probably with some questions.
Yeah, let's have loads of questions tonight, people, because I'm sure this is going to be interesting. Good evening, Philip. Hi, Irena.
Good evening.
How are you?
Good evening.
Well, absolutely brilliant. And both, good evening. We've had you both on before, but obviously separate. So I think everybody knows Philip, but this bio, Irena, if we spent another half an hour, we'd still be doing it, because the list of accolades and achievements and qualifications that you've got are amazing, including working for Defense Intelligence Agency, writing for scientific journals, author of numerous books, including the one that we're going to be discussing tonight, which is absolutely amazing that you've done together. Beyond reasonable doubt, people, listen to these people talk about it. And Irena, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, you're welcome. And I better touch on Philip before we start. And I think everybody knows Philip Mantle, and particularly in United Kingdom. So am I allowed to call you a veteran ufologist? Am I allowed to call you a veteran ufologist?
You've called me worse than that, mate, I'm sure.
So yeah, Philip Mantle and Flying Disc Press, author of his own books, tons and tons of research. I mean, it goes back decades, Philip, doesn't it? So, Philip, welcome.
It does. And, I'll give you a list of my achievements, like Irene, and I've got my cycling proficiency test. I was in the, I got my certificate for swimming 100 yards. And I think that's about it, really.
Yeah, but we've managed to forge an existence and a living, haven't we? But yeah, all good. So, what brought Philip and Irene together to do this amazing volume of work behind me, Beyond Reasonable Doubt?
Well, I published 3 of Irena's books before this, going back to the 70th anniversary of Flying Saucers. With a book that Irena wrote, was very successful. Followed it up with Inside the Lightning Ball, and Sacred Corridors. Again, well-received publications. When things started to happen in Pascagoula, when we'd either find other witnesses or they'd step forward, we had no one on the ground in Mississippi. And I'm quite happy to phone people across the Atlantic, but many a time I get the wrong time. Then they've got this man with his strange sounding accent calling them. So it just made sense that, I needed somebody in the States to help out. And Irena was the obvious choice. So you have this sweet talking lady phone you rather than this guy from the north of England.
They couldn't understand.
Yeah. I mean, you're right about that, Paul. I spoke to a journalist just a few weeks ago from Washington, D.C. on the phone. And in the end, he said, "Sorry, Philip, I can't understand what you're saying." So I said, "Never mind, I'll email you instead, But
it's strange that, though, isn't it? Because you'll have done these radio presentations overseas, and we find it difficult sometimes to understand the Americans, or I do anyway. You might not, but I think it's just the way of things, isn't it? But Irena, how difficult was it digging into this new evidence that's come to the surface and is still coming to the surface, from what I believe?
Yeah, we're getting things all the time, which is surprising because it was so long ago, but it's amazing what you can turn up, especially if you're working with somebody like Philip that finds everything.
Does that surprise you then? Because, I mean, Philip's in UK, that you get a phone call or an email and he's got another lead and he's got more for you to follow up. Do you think, is this ever going to end? And I mean, in a good way, obviously.
Well, he's an awfully good researcher, and he can find people that just are like a needle in a haystack, and he zooms right in and gets them.
Yeah.
You have to have a degree of patience, Paul.
Yeah.
Which I'm not, if you speak to my wife, I'm not necessarily known for, For example, there'll be a video on YouTube and there's all the comments below it, most of which are nonsense, But amongst those comments, there might be just one person who said, "Oh, I saw something that night," or "I have X information." So if you don't read them all, you'll miss out.
I do exactly the same thing, Philip. And I just said, if you'd like to email me, I'd love to hear about it. And I genuinely would, because obviously it's adding more meat to the bones of what we're looking at, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we knew from initial publications, like I started all this with republishing Charles Hickson's book that he co-authored in 1983. And in that book, there are a couple of witnesses. So we knew there were people around at the time. And of course, we're not talking ancient history. I mean, this happened in 1973. And I left high school the following year, 1974. So it's, I'm still here.
Yeah.
So, purely there's others our age, a bit older, a bit younger, that may still be around, and that proved to be the case.
Do you know, Philip? Sorry to stop you. Before we get into some of these accounts and new things that have come to light in this book, I probably should have said this at the beginning. We ought to say a few words, or you and Irene did, about the witness, the man himself, Calvin Parker. Yeah,
there's two witnesses, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. And the main witnesses, Charles, I never got to know, never got to speak to. He died in 2011. But I started working with Calvin in 2018. We published two of his books. And we became very good friends. We'd speak every week, on Skype. In between times, it would be emails. It's very sad that he's no longer with us. I spoke to him a week before he died. I told him I respected him, I loved him, and that he had the respect of thousands of people around the world, people he'll never know, And, his story, he wanted to leave a legacy, Paul, and that legacy was his story of what happened to him and Charlie that night. And I said, well, the best way to do that is to write your own book, Calvin. It's in your own words, and nobody can change it then. It's there for forever. And he was happy with that. And he was a very honourable man, had a terrific sense of humour, And we had a lot of laughs about things in life in general, Paul, not necessarily about what happened to him.
Yeah.
You know, and his wife, I got to know his wife, Wynette, as well. And of course, this October is the 50th anniversary. We were hoping he'd make it for that, but sadly he didn't. And, you know, we look at Irena and myself, and maybe others as well, not just me, will be the torchbearers for the case, you know, and we'll carry on talking about it. We'll investigate anything that comes our way if we can. And, you know, I'll find somebody and I'll send the details to Irena. And then, here you go, Irena, you know,
a little bit more.
Use your network of intelligence agents, you know. But no, I send it to Irena, speak to this person. And I've opened a little file and I've called it Aftermath. And that is things that have come our way after the book came out. They may not necessarily be connected to the case, but some of them are. So, but they've come as a direct result of us talking about it and publishing the book. And it'd be interesting to see where that goes, you know.
Did you find then, Philip and Irena, that, like you've just said, things unrelated to the case, but still of a highly strange nature were coming to light around that time then, in that area?
Well, there's a chapter in the book that, you know, is purely written by Irena in her scientific terms. And we don't know if it's related or not. We suspect it may be, but it's the sonic boom.
Right.
And I'll let Irena tell you the story of that, because it's nothing to do with me. It's something she was involved in personally. Over to you, Irena.
Oh, thank you.
Well, something happened to me at exactly about the same time as the abduction, but it didn't have anything to do with it, as far as I know. I mean, maybe it did. I was in Missouri working on my Ph.D., and she was in Ohio, which is about 600 miles away. And one night, my mother called, and she said, "Did you hear that noise?" And I thought, this is certainly a strange thing to say. And I, said, I couldn't possibly hear that noise. I'm a long ways away. And she kept telling me like I should have heard this noise. And I thought she was off her gourd. But several days later, she's a real skeptic, but several days later, she said there was a huge UFO wave going on there in Ohio, and that people were keeping their kids in and staying in at night and hiding in their basement. It was just like a war zone. And so I was in Missouri, and I just forgot about it for a number of years. But later I was working at Ohio State University, and they had newspapers. And I decided to just go in and see if I could figure out when that happened. And so there was a room that looked like a vault from Indiana Jones or something, zillions of papers, and I really didn't remember when it was. But I guessed that it was the middle of October. And so I pulled out a couple of newspapers, and I found it right away, just a little note about a strange boom. And so I had a date. And a little bit later, I found out this was the same date and about the same, probably the same time as the Pascagoula abduction. But I didn't have any interest in the abduction then at all. That was in the, later. But then I was just curious, and I started doing research on it. And I submitted something to a journal. And this seismologist, the state seismologist of Ohio, became interested, and he helped me find seismograph records or things. And so I published in a scientific journal that this was a really mysterious event, that nobody could explain it. This sound was huge. It was heard from Iowa to the eastern coast and encompassed a very wide area. It was probably the second most widespread sound ever recorded. And so I was very interested in that. And, and I had no interest at all in the abduction. And then he started publishing my books, and he had this British accent, and down in the South, they have another accent. And my husband's from Mississippi, and we would go down there, and he would practically have to translate things for me because I can understand anything anybody said. But so anyway, then I started working with him on that in the Pascagoula abduction. So I got in 2 different ways. One was years ago, and the other was more recent.
Is there more mileage in not just the noise, the sound, the boom, but the actual UFO events that were taking place? Have you looked into any of those to see whether there's any similarities to what was seen, or what allegedly was seen, the occupant of the craft?
Yeah, I mean, Paul, I've trolled every website you can think of.
Yeah.
And I've gone to some of the books I've got. I can't find anything that resembles the creatures that Charlie and Calvin reported seeing that night. I mean, they are totally unique to this event. Why that is, I don't know. Maybe we'll find another case. Yeah. But I spoke to a chap, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head. He's published a series of books on humanoid encounters. And I said, you know, is there anything similar in all the cases? I mean, he's got a series of books. And I said, no, there isn't. You know, there's a book by Charles Bowen, published some years back here in the UK, simply called The Humanoids. Flick through that, can't find anything there. But, you know, that's just what it is. You just have to accept that.
Did Calvin's description of these beings ever change over years, or did he get any? Downloads the wrong word, but did any more memories come back to him, or did everything just stay from that, what he saw, that experience?
I mean, at the beginning, both of the gentlemen had difficulty in describing what the object looked like and how big it was, because the lights illuminating from it was so bright, Paul, that it hurt their eyes, you know. Yeah. And then when this opening appeared, the light that came out of that made it even worse. So, you know, their eyes were screwed up or covered. But, you know, I have we're lucky, because Charlie and Calvin, after the event, within a couple of hours, were in the sheriff's office telling them what they'd seen. Literally in the sheriff's office. The following day, they're at Keesler Air Force Base being interviewed. You know, and that's what we have a transcript of that interview. Yeah. So it's not, you know, taken 20, 30 years later. And I asked Calvin about hypnosis. He says, no, I don't need hypnosis. I can remember it all. Yeah. He says hypnosis clarified 1 or 2 little things, but he said nothing significant.
That's really telling, though, that they've done the interview at the Air Force Base, because it showed the military would surely, I mean, Irene might be able to answer this better than I can, but surely the military would not have shown any kind of interest if there was not something worth looking into. Am I right with that, do you think?
Well, they were worried about radiation, and the authorities took it seriously enough to take them in. And then they had some colonels and doctors and everything else talk to them. So they seemed to take it fairly seriously. Maybe they didn't say so, but they gave him a real good questioning.
Yeah, you have to remember, after the incident, the first place they phoned was Keesler Air Force Base.
Right, okay.
A lady said, we're not in the UFO business anymore, phone your local authorities. And that's how the sheriff became involved. And ironically, the next day they go to Keesler to be checked for radiation. And they say, you know, gentlemen, while you're here, why not tell us what happened? And on the transcript that we have, Paul, that's in the book, there's all the officers' names. There's nothing redacted. You know, everybody that was there is named. There's no tape of it because it was a stenographer. Whereas at at the sheriff's department, they were recorded secretly. You know, secretly recorded, and they thought we'd catch them playing up now, laughing and joking. But of course, they didn't.
Yeah, tell us about that bit, Philip.
Well, they were interviewed at Jackson County Sheriff's Office separately, and to be honest, they weren't believed. They were said, look, guys, you know, if this is a prank, you're going to be in serious trouble. And then they put them into a room together, and there was a table next to them, and the deputy opened a drawer or something and shut it. And he said, I'm just going to go get some coffee. I'll be back in a minute. So he left them by, I don't know, 5 or 6 minutes, come back, went to the drawer again, took something out. They didn't know what it was, and it was a tape recorder. And of course, they played it back, fully expecting Charlie and Calvin to be having a laugh and a joke.
Yeah, or saying we're in it deep now kind of thing. What we done, you know, yeah.
Whereas they weren't. You know, Calvin's going up the wall, literally crawling up the wall. Charlie's saying, oh God, you know. So that changed the attitude of Sheriff Fred Diamond and his deputies. They then began to think, well, something did happen to these guys. And they just let them go home. You know, what it kind of strange to me. If you'd have come in and said, you know, I've been beat up in a bar by 6 guys, they'd go to the bar and try and arrest them. You know, you come in with this and have you on a secret tape, and they say, well, just get yourself off home. You know,
it's the nature of subject matter, though, Philip, isn't it? You know, it's that difficult to deal with.
But what we have in the book is a transcript of an interview Sheriff Fred Diamond did the following day. And a journalist had turned up looking for Charlie and Calvin, but they weren't there. They were at the hospital. So he thought, well, I better get an interview with somebody. And he spoke to the sheriff, and the sheriff said, yeah, something happened to these guys, you know. And so we transcribed this vintage interview, and that's all in the book. You can get it online, but, you know, not everybody has access online. So we transcribed it, and it's there for you to read yourself. And what we found, literally, I think, near the end of actually finishing the book, was a newspaper article where the sheriff himself had a UFO sighting 2 days after, you know. And again, it was only by chance that we saw that and read it, because there's lots of newspaper coverage, you know.
Is he still alive, the sheriff, Philip? Is he still around?
No, the sheriff's deceased. But he did give a number of interviews, I think, at the time. But what is interesting, Paul, is that the police dispatcher who was on duty that night, who took the call from Charles Hickson, is Sheriff Fred Diamond's son. And we've been in contact with him, and he said, I took over 50 calls of UFOs that night, and he entered them on the police log. And he says, then when I went back to the station, there's people there in person reporting it. And there's another account, you know, a bit later on from the sheriff, and he said, we had thousands of calls, thousands. A lot of these will have been journalists, of course, but it showed you the impact that it made. And, you know, make of it what you will.
Well, when you first became involved in this one, obviously I take it that you knew about the case prior to Philip contacting you, Irene, did you?
Yeah, but I hadn't paid too much. I was just interested in the scientific and the noise because it was unexplainable. I didn't pay a bit of attention to the abduction.
No.
Until
when you got involved then with Philip, when did it really start to sort of get your interest and you thought that this is real, something's happening here? And how, another question, and how do you think this rates compared to some of the big cases around the world, such as Travis Walton's case? But we can do that one afterwards. I don't want to bomb you with too many questions. When did it really start to take hold and you thought, this is going to roll and I want to work with this?
Well, it was really unique because usually the abduction type thing happens to people off, you know, in the dark woods with nobody around, with just one witness, and they don't remember it, and they, you know, remember it under hypnosis years later and stuff. So it's sort of ephemeral. Well, with this one, there were 2 witnesses. They both were conscious when it happened and remembered it, and one of them wanted to report it immediately, which they did. And so they were interrogated immediately. Not only that, the police did a really good job and got the secret tape too, which verified that this had happened, that they, you know, they knew it in their minds, and they weren't lying or anything. And so this was very well documented just from the start, because they consciously remembered it. And then the other aspects where it was so unusual, because the whatever you call the things were
the beings, whatever they were,
were different from all the rest. So that made you think that there was no evidence whatsoever of hoaxing, because like if they wanted to hoax, they would probably look up what an alien looks like and things like that and see what an abduction. Well, this was just totally different, which made you sort of trust it, because, you know, if they wanted to be taken seriously with UFOs, they'd probably make up something that's everybody else was saying.
It's more plausible and acceptable to what we want to believe. Yeah. It's good point. So obviously we're not going to say 1 to 10, but where do you think this sits in the grand scheme of big cases throughout the decades? Calvin's and Charles Hickson's abduction.
Well, I think it's probably the best documented of any, because we have the immediate report, we have the immediate really good investigation, and there were other witnesses. And unfortunately, the documents of that 50 people that called in and things were lost, but somebody still said they made them. You know, the hurricane, they lost a lot in the hurricane, but it still shows that a lot of people saw something at the same time. And that's very unusual too.
Yeah, do you know, and it is going to run and run, because I got a report, obviously nothing to do with any of this, but from the 1970s, the 1977 UFO. And this lady's written to me and told me of her experience in 1977 when she was 17 years old.
Yep.
And I've documented it all, and she wants me to talk about it, and she wants me to write about it, because she believes the other 5 people in the car, there were 6 of them in a Mini, Philip, the teenagers, the other 5 people in the car who she's lost touch with, she believes, because it was so traumatic from 1977, that they will still be looking and searching for answers. So potentially, you're doing this live stream now, you've done lots of others bigger than ours, you've done Howard's amazing show, people who've witnessed Pascagoula, you know, boots on the ground, the actual witnesses of the day that are still around and got enough about them to want to look into this, will still be looking for answers. I bet more people come forward.
Well, you know, again, I haven't had a chance to say this, Irena. There are a couple of comments that were made by people saying, I saw this. I've left messages for them, but as yet no response. And I won't pester people. I'll ask a couple of times, and if they're not prepared to answer, then I'll leave it, you know?
Yeah. Do you find that frustrating, though? I don't mean
yes.
It's their prerogative. They can actually do what they want, and that I fully respect that, and so do you and Irena. And I should think the vast majority of people looking into these things. But I find it absolutely frustrating when somebody gives me a really interesting bit of information, and then they just go cold, and there's no more. And
well, I'll give you an example, Paul. After the book was completed and available for sale, I mean, Irena and I have changed the book several times because new information had come up, and I said to Irena, we've got to draw a line in the sand, you know, because we'll never publish it at this rate.
Well, I think that's big enough, isn't it? You know.
Well, you know, but not long after it was out, I got contacted by a lady called Chelsea Norton Prince, and she runs the Ocean Springs Historical Society in Mississippi. And she had an interest in the case. And a friend of hers knew that, and she said, here, I've got 2 boxes of letters that used to belong to Charles Hickson. And she says, back in 2011, when Mr. Hickson died, her mum and dad bought the house and these were left in it. And she kept them safe. She said, I had more, but I got rid of them years ago. She gave them to somebody, and she can't remember who, but she gave them to Chelsea. Chelsea knew of my involvement, contacted me the very next day, and within no time at all, she digitized them all, and I have them here on a thumb drive. Whilst there's no smoking gun in it, Paul, there are interesting snippets. You know, there are some drawings, sketches, pencil sketches of the UFO done by Charlie Hickson himself. There's actually a letter from a NASA physicist saying that he asked NASA to look into the case, to investigate it, and they declined. They refused. So it's not a smoking gun, but the whole thing is, here are 2 boxes of documents that nobody knew existed.
Yeah.
So if there's 2 boxes, there may be other things elsewhere. This lady gave some away.
Well, the ones that have been spirited away, that have gone, I mean, they might surface eventually.
Exactly. And so we know there's other things and other witnesses out there. It's just a question of whether they'll step forward and speak to us or not. And for the first time in the back of the book, there's actually a request for people to contact us. So hopefully that will have some kind of effect. Well, we'll wait and see. But that gives you an idea of what else is maybe lying around out there that we're totally unaware of.
It's I'm not just saying it, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, when you think of the Travis Walton case, and what a wonderful guy. I've stood and sat and listened to him tell his story, and Travis has spent years talking about the same thing, and to audiences, and I'm sure that you've probably heard it numerous times, Philip, and probably yourself, Irena. But what I'm getting at is that this is an historic case, but there's new information coming out all the time. So although we've talked about this previously, I just think there's a lot of fresh information that people need to be hearing about. Before we go on to some of the new witnesses, if you've time to fill us in on a few of them, I'd like to ask people listening tonight to send your questions in block capitals for Irena and Philip. And it doesn't all just have to be about Pascagoula. It can be about anything that you want to ask Philip, UFO or unexplained related, and the same for Irena if possible. So we can move on if you want to tell us a few of the new witnesses and what they saw, if anybody wants to do that, Irena or Philip.
Well, I'll let Irena start because she had more to do with this couple than myself. I'll tell you, I'll just explain how it came about first.
All right.
Like we were saying, check things on messages. Calvin at one point made like a little 8-minute mini doc with a local journalist. And at some point, somebody put that on YouTube. And I'm reading the comments below. And one said, my mum and dad were on the opposite side of the river that night, and they saw the UFO. And I thought, what? And thankfully, this person who put this comment on was using their proper name. So I managed to find her on Facebook, I think it was, explain who I was, and could we speak to her mum and dad. She got back to me, she says, yeah, it was actually their daughter, and it was Mr. and Mrs. Blair. I initially spoke to them on the telephone. They explained they were on the other side of the river that night, and Mr. Blair was going out in a boat. They supplied the oil rigs out in the Gulf, but his boss was late, so he's having a sleep in the car. He's a bit grumpy, and Mrs. Blair said she saw the blue lights over the opposite side of the river. That's where Charlie and Calvin were. This thing looked like it didn't know where it was going, or it was looking for something. And Mr. Blair kind of, reluctantly confirmed that on the phone to me. He wasn't in the best of moods even then. So again, I passed it to Irena. Here you go. And but before I did, I remember right at the beginning, Paul, Mrs. Blair said to me, I often wondered if something similar hadn't happened to us that happened to Charlie and Calvin.
Something telling there.
And I said, why is that? She said, well, I've got these vague impressions of something, almost as if it's out of your peripheral vision. You can't quite make it out. So there's something bothered her. So I passed it to Irena. Irena, you spent most of the time with Mr. and Mrs. Blair. Tell the listeners what she told us.
Well, she was the first person I interviewed, and he just sent me her name. I didn't know that much about her, and I was afraid maybe if I call her, she wouldn't answer or something. And so I called, and first of all, I talked to her husband, who said something about a big splash and a blimp. and he didn't say much, and he passed the phone to her. She said that they were sitting in their car waiting at the end of the pier. The boat was at the end of the pier, and for the supervisor to come. And her husband went to sleep. They were a young married couple at the time. And she began to see this thing flying around. And she kept thinking, the pilot's lost, or what's going on. She couldn't understand because it just kept going around, but it wasn't going anyplace. And she thought it's searching for something, or the pilot's lost or something. And so then she and her husband decided, about 9 o'clock or so, she and her husband decided to take his clothes down to the ship. And so they were walking down the pier, and she was behind him, and something flopped up out of the water right in front of her onto the pier. And she said it looked just like a person, looked like a man. And she was real emotional about it. And, I asked her, is it fish? And she said, no. Is it a porpoise? No. And she said it looked like a man, and that she couldn't understand why he didn't come up to breathe. It just went back down, and nothing came up to breathe. And so they walked on down, got in the boat. And then she said about 12 o'clock, she came back. And I thought this was kind of strange because she didn't say what they did for, 3 hours on the boat. But she said she was terrified, and she ran back to the car. Well, she was very, very emotional about the thing that flopped up on the pier, but I didn't know why, and we just kept talking about it. And I kept asking why, and she didn't know why. She said something about maybe she has more memories or something, but she just didn't know why, but she was just really emotional about it. And we talked and wrote it for about 2 years. And then, unfortunately, her husband became ill, and her husband was a skeptic. He didn't think UFOs exist. He didn't, thought the whole thing was crazy, and was always telling her, don't talk about it, it's crazy and everything. So he got sick, and probably knew he was going to die, and told her just before he went on a ventilator that they had been abducted. But and then he told her a little bit more. She put him on the phone to Philip and recorded it. And he remembered this abduction. He remembered being on board. He remembered these things swimming across the ocean or the river. And one of them, for some reason, they thought might have been real physical to him. He kept calling one a doctor and said he really kept his eye on that one. And so he apparently had seen what you might call beings or things before, and had sort of made an agreement to protect her, which that would be real scary to me if, my husband said that, and, I'd think, ugh. But she seemed to trust him and everything. And so then later she remembered a little bit too, and then later she went into hypnosis. But I talked to her for 2 years or so before anything like that happened. And then unfortunately her husband died, and he was on the ventilator then, and he couldn't talk, so she probably had a lot more questions and didn't get answers.
Yeah. Do you think, Irene, that he felt he had to share this, he had to come clean with his wife towards the end then? Do you think that's why he sat on it for all those years? And it's probably really troubled him if he's played the part of a skeptic, and all of this is a load of rubbish, and this didn't happen, I don't believe in any of this. And then suddenly does a full 360. And at a time in his life when, towards the end of his life, when he's not really, I wouldn't think, going to do anything like that, I would have thought that's when he's really laying it on the line and telling the truth. Because at that period in your life, when you're coming towards end of it, you're not going to suddenly start telling lies and bloody fly there, sorry. I wouldn't have thought so. I mean, he'll have been on the, I think
it's almost like the deathbed confession.
Yeah.
Paul. although he didn't die straight away. I mean, I literally spoke to him while he sat in the hospital.
Yeah.
He was going to have an operation. He wasn't sure how it'd go. And he told me, I saw the blue lights, saw the alien. He didn't call them aliens, he called them the humanoids, etc. And he had his wife, Maria, filming on the cell phone. And I have a copy of that. And she was, even though he was really ill, she was hopping mad at him, you know. And he said he kept it quiet to protect her, and I can understand that.
Yeah, you know? I wonder though, Philip, what it was that he took to the grave with him. Sorry for sounding so macabre, but obviously he'd got some knowledge aside from Pascagoula about the sound.
I mean, you know, we got some details of what he said to his wife Maria. Irena logged all that, and again, it's all in the book, every bit of it. And then Maria wanted to undergo hypnosis, and I said, okay, I'll see if we can sort it out. And I did. I got a local hypnotherapist, a professional, and we had it conducted at Calvin Parker's house because she'd become friends with Calvin. And we didn't tell the hypnotherapist anything, Paul, just the date, time, location. That was it. And we filmed it as well. And so she goes under hypnosis. She's, again, she's quite emotional in parts. She's worried where her husband is. She can't find him. She talks about these beings. They remove some of her eggs. They're interested in DNA. They want to make children that can walk among us and not be recognized. Now, I know hypnosis is a contentious subject. We're fully aware of that. But it was something that Mrs. Blair wanted to do. So, we did it. And I know we shouldn't, I don't know the best way to say this, but one of the things that I did see, and when we filmed this, was the look on the hypnotherapist's face when she started talking about these things, because she had no idea what was to come,
Completely shocked.
And, we have a little comment from her in the book as well. And like I say, it was all filmed, all recorded. And we did the same with Calvin a few weeks later. Same hypnotherapist. She obviously knew the subject matter now. So I gave her a couple of questions to ask Calvin. He'd been under hypnosis before, Paul, and he knew the routine. And I said, let's just ask Calvin before anything happens. He stood on the pier with his rod in the water, looking out. What does he see? Just tell me the view. Can he just describe the view in front of him? Which he'd already told me, So she asked, and he said, well, I can see the road bridge that goes over the river. There's a boat going out. He even told me the name on the boat. It's a company name. I think it's initials. Noah. N-O-O-A, I think it is. And right at the end of it, he says, oh, and there's two figures on the opposite side of the river. Now, if those two figures, Mr. and Mrs. Blair, perhaps they were too far away to be seen. Maybe it's someone else. Perhaps we'll never know. But it's just a little thing, and if you're not listening, you'll miss it.
Pick up on it, yeah.
And again, the transcripts of these hypnosis sessions are in the book. And I asked Calvin about hypnosis. He said, it don't matter to me. I can remember it anyway. So, But again, we had it filmed and we have it for posterity. And, people will criticize us for using it. Fair enough. But we're damned if we do and damned if we don't. So it's there. If you want to dismiss the hypnotic testimony, that's fine by me. But it is there. And
you can't please everybody, Philip. I did that talk at Awakening last week. And at midpoint in it, I said, this is going to be too much for some and not enough for others. Do you know what we're talking about? My own experiences, and you can't please everybody. I just jump back to Irena. You said you might not be able to tell us. You might want people to get the book and read these other bits. But can you tell us anything about what this other witness, the man who was a skeptic, or he said he was until we found out at the very end of his life, what other things had he seen and experienced? Are you allowed to tell us?
Oh, in general, he experienced being on the craft. He said, I mean, if it's a craft, he said that, he said, first of all, something about there were figures that were 6 feet tall. And then I don't know if they were the same ones that were on board or not.
But prior to that, Irena, he'd also got some other experiences in his life prior to that. Am I right, or have I misheard that?
Yeah, he had, I guess, experiences off and on through his life, and he had also been married several times.
Yeah.
And had kids, and that was kind of worrisome that he was there. He had these. He said he had these experiences, and he kept it to himself all these years. I mean, you know, you always think maybe he just said that to please his wife, and maybe nothing happened. But she seemed to believe him, and in some ways, it was believable because at that point he didn't have to worry about, you know, people make fun of him because you don't care about that when you're, you know, dead.
End of his life. I think it would have been a sad end if he went out lying, and so I'm inclined to think that he's probably telling the truth. It makes you wonder how many other people really skeptically minded are sitting on things that are just too difficult to face. Jumping away from Pascagoula for a moment, do you know of any cases like that, Philip, or anybody that you know has had an experience, but they're not going to talk about it?
Yeah. I mean, I've got several, Paul, you know, that people have contacted me one way or another, and they want to share what happened to them, but they don't want to make it public. They don't you know, even using a false name. I'm sure Irena has as well.
I'm sure.
One of them was Calvin. Obviously, he didn't think about it for about 50 years.
Yeah. But it's not unknown, is it, Paul? You know, that people will step forward at some point for different reasons. You know, it might be their age, it might be because they see something on television that persuades them to do it, or, you know, I'll give you an example. A case I investigated way back in the 1980s, local to here, UFO landing seen by some children and their mother, you know, at Normanton. And I wrote about it. We interviewed the kids and the mum, and I left it at that. I think it was the last year or the year before. I'd have to excuse my memory. I was on a documentary somewhere, and out of the blue, you know, a lady contacts me and she said, she's from New Zealand, Paul. She says, I'm an expat, you know. And she said, you talked about this thing in Normanton, but you didn't use the family name. I just forgot. And I said, well, it was Mrs. Westerman and the children. And she come back to me on email. She says, my best friend was called Westerman and still lives in Normanton.
So there's another connection. So
she asked her best friend, and yes, that was one of the children from all them years ago. And I connected with her. And then about a year later, a fella contacted me. Again, totally out of the blue, Paul, and he said, my partner was one of those children you interviewed back in 1980. And I said, well, can I speak to her? She said, yeah. So I got you, give me the phone number. I spoke to her, and she was one of the kids' friends that they were playing out at the time, and, you know, but you have to, this also reinforced a lesson, because she said there were two scientists came to interview them. Yeah. When no scientists came, it was myself and Mark Birdsall.
So there's a bit of cloudiness in.
So if that story was told by her, all of a sudden you have two mythical scientists that turn up, you know, and these things came out. I tried to find these children again down the years, Paul, you know, by the local media, and I had no success because there was 5 or 6 of them.
Can you be sure that two scientists? Obviously, you came, yes, but can you be sure that two scientists didn't?
Because you described what one of them looked like, and it's a spitting image of Mark Birdsall, right? You know, and so and Irena and I, people will say, "Oh, these witnesses that you've spoken to, they've stepped out of the limelight to get their 5 minutes of fame." Well, Mr. and Mrs. Blair didn't step out. It was their daughter that just made a comment on YouTube, and I happened to see it. You know, they were quite content not to speak. But when Calvin's book first came out, this is another way we've worked on things, Paul, just to give people an example. A gentleman from Greece contacted me. He's called Stephanos Panagiotakis. That took me months and months and months to learn how to pronounce that.
I bet you've got that on a bit of paper in front of you, haven't you?
Well, in 1981, so 8 years after the event happened, Stephanos was in the Greek Merchant Navy. He was a radio operator, and his ship docked in Pascagoula. And he was also a UFO researcher and used to write for a magazine, was mad keen on the Pascagoula case. So he thought, this is great. He found Charles Hickson and interviewed him. And he went to the local police station to see if they could help with any other info. And they said, go and speak to Pastor Sigalis. And they gave him his address because we think he saw something that night. So Stephanos recently turned up on this gentleman's doorstep, knocked on his door, and the pastor was of Greek descent. And there's a Greek man stood there, so invited him in. And what happened was on that night of October the 11th, 1973, Pastor Sigalis, along with a chap called Mr. Broadhurst, who was from the Police and Probation Service, and a young lady who was a church volunteer, were en route to a church-sponsored meeting of people with alcoholic problems. And as they're heading out of town, this young lady is looking out the passenger window and sees this thing coming. And she alerts the two men in the front. And they see it go right across the road in front of them, Paul. And the description they give is very, very similar to what Charlie Hickson and Parker said. And it was heading in their general direction. And Stephanos interviewed this gentleman and gave us the transcript of the interview. So we had a witness. He was deceased. Mr. Broadhurst was deceased. But then there was this young lady in the back of the car. Well, I was assisted by a colleague, but we actually found her name. She was called Joanne Hallmark. And we even found a photograph of her from 1974, the year after. And it turned out I think she taught in one of the local schools for a year, and she was a church volunteer. I found a couple of social media accounts for her, but had never been used in years, Paul. You know, I left messages, nothing. So I left it. I went back sometime later at one of these accounts, and there was a mention of a church. So I do what you do these days. I Googled it. And I found this church, and it wasn't in Mississippi. It was in Maryland. I've no idea whereabouts that is in America. And the church had a website. And lo and behold, on this website, there are some sermons you could click on and listen to. But the sermons were given by two men called Hallmark. Right. And I'm thinking, what? Is that a husband, maybe? Sons? And the church had a general email address, info@churchwhatever.com, So I emailed them, explained I was looking for this lady. Didn't say what for. I said she worked with the Pastor Sigalis in Mississippi back in 1973. If she's still around, could you pass on my message? And several weeks later, she replied, confirmed she'd worked with the pastor, and how could she help? So I had to ask the question, Paul, This is who I am. This is what we're looking for. Again, it was a few weeks waiting. And she come back, described everything, passed it on to Irena, who was on the telephone, and interviewed her accordingly. And she even sent us an up-to-date photograph of what she looks like today. And that is in the book. So that was another way we found people. This lady didn't step out of the woodwork. We found her. And it's just another example of the witnesses that were in and around the area that night. You spoke to her, Irena. Tell us about Mrs. Hallmark.
Well, I just called her cold, but she remembered it real well. She was a young woman then, and she was just a little bit embarrassed because she was in a car with two men. And she said, well, but this is okay because she was playing the piano for the church, and, it was a church function and all that. But she said she was the first person that saw it. She was in the back seat of the car, and she knew it wasn't anything normal. I mean, it wasn't a helicopter, and it didn't go like an airplane, and it was sort of cylindrical. And I think they stopped and looked at it because it was so odd. And that was the same night as when the abduction happened.
Yeah, and what's interesting, Paul, when Stephanos was there in 1981, he got in the car, I think it was Mr. Broadhurst, and they drove the route. And at the point where they saw it, Stephanos just took a photograph through the car window. I mean, there's nothing there. No. But then he had the picture developed and got one of them to draw the UFO on the picture.
Oh, in the fabulous, yeah.
And we have, we have that.
Do you know, Philip? And I know this applies to Irena as well, but you've just, with what you did then and contacting the church and everything, this is why, and I don't care if it sounds like I'm being nice to Philip, this is why you're such a good investigator, because you've just gone from A to Z. You've just gone through everything to get to that point, not just assuming something and saying, oh, there's an alien base out under sea without any prior knowledge or what we're doing, just metaphorically. But you went through all that with us then. And I think that's a lesson to myself, to everybody else watching, because it's been methodical and get into the actual source of everything. And a perfect example of that. And I suppose that's the way you'll go about things, Irena, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising. I could say an example. It doesn't have anything to do with UFOs.
Well, please do.
Well, I found out by accident, by old papers in an attic, that I was related to John Purdue, that founded Purdue University, which is a huge university. And I wrote a book later, but I was doing research on him. And he lived in this one county in Ohio, quite a distance away. And so I was going down to the county seat and see if I could find information. Well, on my way there was an accident, and all the traffic was stopped. And so instead of sitting in my car for 2 or 3 hours, I wandered around the town. I wandered clear out of town down this little road, and there was this little building just among houses that said library. And so I walked into the library, and this had nothing to do with John Purdue. And everybody stared at me because it's kind of like a little town library, with people who knew each other. Everybody stared at me. And so I said, do you have anything on John Purdue? And they said, who's John Purdue? And I explained. And so these people scurried back in their rooms. And sometime later, they came out with this big cart full of stuff. And I thought, oh, they had the wrong person. Well, it turned out they had this little tiny library in the middle of nowhere, had all this information on John Purdue. They had his bookkeeping books from a business he had in another part of the and everything. And I just couldn't believe it. But I mean, that's just how things happen. Yep. Just total accident. You can just come across a whole lot of information.
Tons of information. Did you revisit it? Did you go back again?
Yeah. And I added a lot. It added a lot to the book because I found out where he lived, and I could find the actual house.
Yeah.
And I knew who he was talking to because it was the logbook of his business. And so he had it written down every day who he talked to and who he did business with and everything else. And some of the descendants were still in the town and everything. So I just found out a ton of information. I found out how he met his business partners and everything else.
Thank you. I think what we'll do now, if Les is about and we've got any questions, are you happy to answer some questions, Irena and Philip?
Well, can I just say give me another example of how we found information? When I first met Calvin, we started with nothing, Paul. It was a we knew of the story. I had Charlie's book, and that was it. So I politely pestered the living daylights out of everybody I could think of. We have to remember, at the time of the incident, Dr. James Harder and Dr. Alan Hynek were involved. Hynek founded the Center for UFO Studies. So I contacted them. Amongst many others, they came back to me and said, yeah, we've got a file here. It is, Philip. So it's a PDF file. And most of it is newspaper cuttings. But in amongst all this, there is a one-page typewritten document written on an old typewriter. And it's dated October the 13th. They put 12 before and they typed over it. So it's 2 days after the event happened. And it's entitled Puncture Wounds. And it describes Charlie and Calvin stripping down to their underwear. And they being given the once-over. And that they found, in inverted commas, puncture wounds on Charles Hickson's forearm and Calvin Parker's foot. And there were photographs. Now, Charlie said when these two creatures first got hold of him, he felt some kind of, prick in his arm. Calvin, whilst on board this thing, said, I'm laying on this transparent table. They take off my lower clothing and my shoes and socks, and they stick something in my foot, and it hurts. So we had the testimony of the gentleman talking about these minor injuries. Now we have a document. So I asked Calvin, I said, who was it that examined you? He said it was Dr. Harder. Although he wasn't a medical doctor, he just asked us to strip down. So we did. But there were no photographs. So I thanked them, fascinating. Maybe a year later, Paul, it was a long time after. I put the exact date in the book, but I can't remember it. This same gentleman emailed me from the Center for UFO Studies and said, Philip, I've been looking through some files today, not for this. You've probably got this already, but I thought I'd better send it to you just in case. It's the photographs of these injuries. And we know who's who because there's no face on them, because it's a photograph and they've written the name on the back. So he scanned them front and back for me. And there you have Charlie Hickson's arm, inner forearm with these marks, and Calvin Parker's foot. They are only minor injuries, Paul, but when you add the verbal testimony, the document, and then the photographs, to me, it's a compelling piece of evidence that there was a physical component to these events. It wasn't just illusionary or imaginary, And it also showed that if you're polite and persistent and patient,
and you get the results,
and you're contacting people, and they come across something, they'll say, oh, Philip's looking for this stuff, I'll send it him. As I've done myself, Paul, with other people. I'm thinking, oh, so-and-so's working on this and I've just found this. I'll send it to them.
You've done it for me, Philip. You've done me a great thick wad of paperwork that must have... Well, it cost a fortune for you to send through post because I sent it back to you, but scanned everything. So, yeah, you've done it for me. Thank you.
So we have, and again, in the book, there's the whole story of how this unraveled. There is the document and the photographs. We had a couple of the photographs just enhanced a little bit so you can make it out a bit clearer, but you can see it. It's no problem. They're not major injuries, Paul, but they are what they are.
It adds up and it fits together with everything else that you'd found. So,
but it shows how we've worked as well. We've put the feelers out. We remind people we're here, and whenever we found something, there's a little mailing list. I say, oh, we found this. And it goes out to all these people, and it's kind of a reminder that we're still looking for things. So if they come across anything, please keep us in mind. And it's worked. Questions.
If Les is around, we can go to questions. I hope he's yes, there he is. He's on cue. Thanks, Les.
Fascinating show so far, and thank you to our guests tonight for coming on, Irena and Philip. Thanking everybody for supporting us in the chat tonight. Some great questions are coming, and I'm going to start off with one that I'd got earlier from Don Lodge. And most people, or some people, know that Don runs your website.
He does. He's absolutely
www.truthproof.uk. Yeah. So, and the question is for you, Philip, or Irena, for that matter. The question is, Did Charlie and Calvin, did they get any threats or did they get any visits from the Men in Black, so-called Men in Black, after
None
their
at all.
encounter?
None at all. They got visits for everybody and their dog. I mean, literally, even a very well-known person in related subjects. Charlie had a visit one day from Eric von Daniken.
Really?
And I've been in touch with Eric von Daniken's secretary or assistant, and he took 2 photographs, one of Charlie and one of the incident scene, and I have those photos. And in the letters that we were given that belonged to Charlie, a lot of people would write and thank him because they'd come and see him, and these are just ordinary folk, you know. Great to meet you, Charlie. Thank you for, you know, the wonderful food your wife cooked for us, and things like that. But no, nothing, you know, nothing untoward whatsoever as far as we're aware.
Really? Because, I mean, you do hear of cases, don't you, where people have had these experiences and they are, or seems to be visited by Men in Black.
But I have to remember, Charlie was the torchbearer for the case. He would talk on TV, conferences, church halls, you name it.
Yeah.
But Calvin wouldn't. He disappeared off into the undergrowth and didn't really want anything to do with it. On occasion, at Charlie's request, he'd pop up and say a few things, you know, but by and large, he wished that nobody would have spoken about it at all and he could have just forgotten about it, you know.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Philip. I'm going to put this one on the screen. You might be able to read it, but I'll read it out as well. Alex Thompson, question for Philip. Has he had any reports or UFO or strange things recently? So have you had any recent reports you can talk about, Philip?
I've got no nothing that's been reported coming from, you know, this time frame. Again, I'm communicating with somebody again who's seen something around the time of the 1970s with the case. I passed on a lady to Irena just a couple of weeks back. It was a bit vague about the dates, but Irena has interviewed her. You know, it's in the 70s probably. But nothing of recent has come to my attention that you know, had it warranted any investigation. I mean, gentlemen, a while back sent me some video film, and it's just a lie. I mean, nothing you can do with it. It's just a black background with a white light on it. And I had to be honest with him, saying, sorry, there's nothing I can do, you know. And he was all right with that, you know. But that's the way it is.
Okay, I've got a good question here from Dark Angel. And Dark Angel is asking, what do the guests think the aliens were trying to achieve by revealing themselves like they did? Have you got any thoughts on that, Irena?
Irena, any ideas?
He always asks challenging questions, this fella, but they were the questions. Have you come to any conclusions of what you think they were trying to achieve?
Well, neither of the witnesses could really see anything. The inside was so bright they just saw white, and then they saw something that was like they were scanning them. And one of them described this possible scanner as like a deck of cards. And today you'd say, well, it looks like an iPhone or something. But it was a lot more. Today, if you get, you know, an MRI, they put you in a big gurney and they wheel you in the big machine. Well, this was just a little thing. And they were giving the impression of scanning, things like that. But actually, you don't know what they look like or anything else. They may just put that in your mind, you know, because there's all kinds of pictures of aliens and none of them make any sense. They're not like, you know, our men going out with spacesuits.
Yeah. And I would also say that we don't know for the fact that we're dealing with an alien, you know, here.
Yeah.
That's one of the theories. Me personally, I keep an open mind on it. Eventually, that's what Calvin believed, that they were, you know, not of this earth. But in the past, he'd gone through various ideas of what they may or may not be. You know, he didn't really know. So are they revealing themselves? What I find strange about the abduction phenomena is that some people, like Charlie and Calvin, could remember everything without the use of any hypnosis or anything like that. But then you have cases where people say the aliens have blocked their mind not to be able to remember it. But of course, it all comes out under hypnosis. So what was the point in blocking it in the first place? Surely they must realize that, that these memories can be retrieved in inverted commas. So
yeah, but Philip, how many people though are actually coming out and telling the world? Because I bet you there's for every person that comes out, I bet you there's countless hundreds of people that have had experience throughout. Not all that are sat in silence.
What I would say is that whatever happened to Charlie and Calvin, and I don't know, was very traumatic for both individuals. Charlie dealt with it better because he'd been a veteran in the army and had fought in Korea and been in some serious situations under fire. Right. Calvin was just a young fella, still green around the gills. Like I remember when I was 18, I was as daft as a brush,
I'm still on, mate.
Simple as that. And so I think what you find with any experience, Paul, that is traumatic, that a lot of people don't initially come forward, but it's like the Me Too movement where young ladies have been abused. And initially, it might take one or two whistleblowers to step out of the limelight and say, well, Jeffrey Epstein did this to me. And then others found the courage to do so. But we know from some of the information gleaned from a sicko like that there were a lot more young ladies involved. So it's the same I think it's the same with any kind of trauma, Paul.
Yeah.
It's like my dad. My dad fought in the Second World War. I know he was there. I had his medals on my leather jacket. Would he talk about it? Would he? Hell is like.
No.
He had a big hole in the back of his leg where shrapnel got him. And thankfully, nothing more serious than that. And it's only when he got into his 80s, in the last couple of years before he died, that he started to tell us a few things. And it's just, because it was traumatic.
Yeah.
So it's the same with any, Calvin was traumatized. He ended up in the hospital, and that trauma carried him. He was like the real life Hulk. Remember the TV series from the 1980s? Dr. David Banner, were changing to the Hulk, and there was a journalist chasing him. And every time the journalist got near, he would move on to another town. Calvin Parker did that in real life with a wife and kids, And in the end, Waynette booted him out and said enough's enough. So they had a separation, if you like, for a period of time. I mean, he phoned his insurance company up, his life insurance, and said, "Am I covered for suicide?" And they said no. So we went and picked a fight in a cowboy bar with half a dozen cowboys in the hope that they'd kill him. Well, they levered the living daylights out of him, threw him out. He was so confused, he got to his feet, staggered around and walked back in again, got another thumping, but obviously they didn't kill him. And that's how this thing affected him,
Yeah.
It was a traumatic experience. I don't know anybody who suffers from sleep paralysis or any kind, which is one of the kind of explanations put forward to try and explain these events, suffer from such trauma afterwards. Sleep paralysis we have every night. It's what stops us falling out of bed. Sometimes you kind of wake up and you're still in that situation where you can't move, but you're not traumatized by it.
Yeah, we'll do questions. Get to Outer Limits question.
Yeah,
I want to answer that.
Chris Evans from Outer Limits. Irena and Philip, besides Pascagoula, what other abduction case stands out for you and why?
Irena, I'll let you answer first.
They all do to me. I think there's been several that were abduction cases that were just regular cases that stood out really well to me because they were so well documented. But I think I know Kathleen Marden, and she's a niece of Betty Hill, I'm sorry. And we've talked about that and compared this to what her relatives went through. And she's very interested in everything and probably had an abduction herself. And she thinks they might run in families.
Well, I'll jump in if that's all right. I mean, my first book came out in 1994. It's called Without Consent. It's all about UK cases. And there was several people in there that impressed me, but there was one young man called David, and we used a pseudonym for him. But he lived in Pwllheli, in northwest Wales. And at the time, he was unemployed. And he went to a friend's house one night for the birthday. And he said, I'm walking home on the main road. You and I would never call it a main road in 1,000 years. You know what I mean? It was the only road. And he said, up ahead, there was a field, and there was a light in this field. And he said, part of me said, don't go near it. But another part of him said, look, have a look. And he went up the side of this field, and there's some bushes. He parted the bushes, and there's a thing sat on the ground that you would almost describe as looking like the space shuttle, you know. And then he felt a hand on his shoulder from behind, and there was this humanoid creature with a helmet on that was pretty much shaped like a 50-pound piece. He goes on board this thing. He's on a bed or a table. There's a big screen in front of him, and he can see the planets going past. Now, David was a rock fan, so he had a Sony Walkman with a tape cassette in it. And these creatures took this tape cassette out and put it in this panel. And he says, you're in this otherworldly environment, and then this rock music comes blaring out. Anyway, they give him warnings about Earth's future, as they did with Calvin Parker, actually.
That was going to be one of my questions. So, yeah, we'll get to that after these questions, yes. Yeah,
so he's deposited back on the road. He was actually picked up by a police car. And the policeman took him home. Now, he lived with his mum, single mother, and he remembered all of this, remembered it all. He told his mum, and he was literally lying in his bed, shaking. The next day, she went to the local library and got a UFO book. There was only one, and she found a UFO group in Oxford. They were called Contact International. I think they're still going. She managed to get a phone number for them and rang them. And they said, okay, we'll make arrangements to come up and see you. So that night, David is, still in bed, shaking. So she said, forget this. She literally threw him in the car and drove to Oxford. It started to snow at this point, unannounced, and turned up on this fella's doorstep. And David was literally in the back of the car shivering. So when I talked to him, I interviewed him a couple of times. I could relate to him because he'd got long hair, denims. I used to be exactly the same when I was that age. I also like rock music. And he told me the account. And I said, well, you take me back to where it happened. Show me. So he said, yeah. And I didn't realize at the time, I've got a photograph of him standing by this field, and he stood there like a plank. He's scared. And I didn't realize it until afterwards. And so I documented the case. I wrote it in the book, and I sent him a copy. And he wrote back, thank you very much, Philip. And I didn't hear anything from him until 3 years later. He now got married. And he said, I've just read the book. So it took him 3 years before he would go anywhere near the book. I spoke to him on the phone. I said, what happened? He says, I actually had to have hypnotherapy. Not regressive hypnosis, but hypnotherapy. Because it scared me that much. I was having nightmares about it. And he said, I started writing spontaneous poetry as a result of what happened. He said he'd got a job by this time. He was unemployed. I got a job. He was working in a restaurant, and this poetry would pop in his head, and he'd get a napkin and write it down, instantly. So he impressed me. There was no other witnesses. There's nothing else, but he didn't have to have hypnosis. But it was the kind of after effects and side effects, if you like, impressed me more than anything. And similar in some respects to Calvin. Calvin was traumatized and walked away from it. And you know, I've left him be since then. I don't know any more about him, but he really did impress me. I hope that answers the question.
Fully. Thank you, Philip. Are we good to go any more, Les?
Yeah, I think I've got the sober camper. The sober camp is asking, did the two men involved continue to get visited after the event?
Uh,
As in alien related, I think that's what he means. Yeah.
Well, again, I'll answer it, and the answer is yes. Calvin had another encounter in 1993, so 20 years later. He went fishing on a boat this time, a little boat. He said, I'm only going out for a couple of hours. It's daylight. So he took some water with him and a sandwich. His wife had made him a sandwich. And it's in the boat, and he looks up, and there's a cloud, and the cloud opened. I don't mean opened with rain, I mean opened. When he finally gets back to shore, it's dark. He's got all this goo all over him. His wife had driven out to the car looking for him, and she left a note under his windscreen. Where are you? He went back home and told her that there'd been engine failure on the boat or whatever. He had a friend who knew a little bit about UFOs and said to Calvin, there's a guy called Bud Hopkins going to be speaking at a UFO convention in Florida this weekend. I think you ought to go and see him. So they got in the car, they drove I think it's about a 12-hour drive to Florida, turned up at this hotel where the convention was, unannounced. Calvin wouldn't go in, but so his mate went in, found Bud. Bud says, here's the key to my hotel room. I'll meet you there after I've done my lecture. And he did. I mean, I knew Bud personally. He was a lovely guy. And eventually he put Calvin under hypnosis. And then we have the tape of that. We have the recording of it, and he details this encounter. Again, it's the same ugly creatures, he called them. There was also a female creature back in 1973. She's now still there, you know. And this time he says, I've had enough of this. I'm going to look for a door, and wherever it is, I'm going out of it, and she's coming with me. So he has a fight with her. In other words, you know, and he also related two events that happened to him as a young fella. Similar with Charlie. Charlie became what we probably call a contactee. He got messages, you know, telepathic messages from the aliens. And he was convinced that there was something dramatic was going to happen on Earth, that there'd be alien involvement, and he would be part of it. He didn't know what it was. And then a couple of years later, it's in his own book. They'd been out to visit the in-laws, I think it was, on Mother's Day, and driving back, him and the whole family saw this thing. And again, Charlie also related two events of when he was a young fellow as well. It wasn't with Calvin at that time, you know, it was when he was a young fellow himself. And they're not in this book. We published them previously because this book only deals with the events in 1973. So I hope that you know answers the question.
Yeah, fully.
And just if any audience members, any stream members have just come in, can you give us tell us what the book title is called, Philip? And
it's Beyond Reasonable Doubt: The Pascagoula Alien Abduction. Irena and I were conscious of today's financial situation. So we made the book available as a huge, great hardback. That's the most expensive. That's what Paul keeps looking at behind him.
There it is. I'm also looking at this, Beyond Reasonable Doubt.
Well, there you go. Well, you know where we got it from now, don't you?
Yeah. It's great. It's fitting.
Yeah, Philip, is it a free Kindle download?
It's not free. But
right.
That body of work you're not going to give away.
But we also made it in a 10x8 softback, a 9x6 softback, a Kindle, and an audio book. So there is a whole range of things. We're hoping that can fit most people's, you know, wallets. We know what to find out. we don't make a huge profit on these books, so please don't think we do. We've kept it at an absolute minimum.
So where do they go to get the
to
book?
Amazon?
Or...
Just go to Amazon.
Amazon.
Wherever they are in the world, Amazon is the place to go. And we hope that they find it of some interest. And the reason we called it Beyond Reasonable Doubt, we had a different title for it. I don't know if Irena remembers, but I was watching a courtroom drama one night, and they said, "Oh, you've got to prove beyond reasonable doubt." And I emailed Irene and I said, "I've got this idea for the title, because what we say in the book, and some people will maybe criticize for it, we're confident if we took all of this information into court, we could prove something extraordinary happened that night. We'll never be able to prove they were abducted by aliens or anything else, but something extraordinary that currently we cannot explain." And the skeptics will probably have a field day with that, but I couldn't care less.
No, there's too many elements and there's too much meat around the bone from loads of other people now, not just Charles and Calvin, to add a lot of weight to this being a genuine account. Have we done with questions, Les, or is there any more?
Well, I want to get this one in, and this is not a question, but it is a compliment to you both, Irene and Philip. So Ronald Booth is saying, great case is Pascagoula. Philip and Dr. Irena have done a very good job at investigating and resuscitating this event.
Well, it's right, because when I was starting to look for Calvin Parker, the case was dead. I mean, I contacted a guy who was a UFO researcher in Mississippi. He'd never even heard of it, and he sent me some links that he found on Google. I thought, well, I can do that myself.
Yeah.
I won't tell you what I thought about him, but I thought, So we literally started with Charlie's book. That's all we had. Everything else was started from scratch. And there was a point my wife said to me, "You look like a man on a mission," because things were coming in on a regular basis. And then they go to we also had assistance in the early days from a guy at MUFON called Douglas Wilson. Again, Douglas is in the book, and we thank him, for his assistance. And it just kept coming. And like we said, we wanted to get these things documented before it was too late, because people are of a certain age. Mr. Blair passed away. In the book, we have the memorials to 3 guys that, although we interviewed them, they've since passed away. And then, of course, Calvin himself, passed away on August the 24th. So had we not documented all of this stuff, a lot more would have gone and is lost forever. And so that's why, if you mention it on anywhere online and I find it, you probably get a message from me saying, "Could you tell us a bit about that, please?" And
it's just fabulous the way you've gone about it, and the way that Irena's really sort of like a terrier, just got involved with these people and got to the information. So,
well, I've embarrassed them before, Paul, and said, I'm amazed that me, a daft coal miner's son from East Ardsley in West Yorkshire, is working with a lady like Dr. Irena Scott with a CV that is that long it can fill.
I weren't going to read that out today. I mean, it would just it speaks for itself. Anybody can Google Irena and see that she's really got the credentials that we're alluding to.
Okay,
now then, what?
Yeah, okay then, Paul. Yeah, I'll come back later with some more if that's okay.
Yeah. Irena or Philip, but what was the message that they got that were imparted to them by these beings?
Well, it was only Calvin, and
right.
Calvin was the kind of guy, Paul, if he didn't want to talk about something, he wouldn't. So there was no point asking him the same question 3 times.
You weren't going to get it.
The answer he got the first time is one he's got. So eventually, he told us about when he was on board this thing, and he called it a curse. They called it a curse. The whole thing perturbed him, but different elements of what happened perturbed him even more. And this was one of them. And he said he was shown things from the past and from the present and the future. And the ones in the future were not nice. The Earth, everybody was at war with each other, ecological disaster, nuclear war, a virus, from the present that was going to strike mankind. Some people have called that COVID. Calvin didn't call it COVID,
No.
And he said this was a curse. And it's similar to, I mentioned my first book when I was interviewing some of the British witnesses to these events. Some of them had how can I put it, an ecological message given to them about the Earth's future. And if you Earthlings don't mend your ways, this is where you're going to end up.
Right then, so to Irene, why do you think that people like Pete Philip says he's an ex-coal miner, I'm an ex-joiner, I've not had a message, Philip hasn't, but why do they give it to everyday people and not people in power who are in a position that they could perhaps make a bit of a change in the world? Why just give them to ordinary Joe? These incredible revelations of the foretelling of doom for mankind if they don't change their ways. Why do they give it to someone who can't actually do anything about it? Have you any views on that, Irene?
Well, they're not going through the hierarchy. I mean, if they landed on, Putin's palace or the, White House, and the top people, in our status thing acknowledge them, well, then, but they're not going through that way. They're going through regular people.
But it seems pointless because we can't change anything.
Well, maybe they think our hierarchy is stupid.
Yeah.
I'll give you another answer to that. An old friend of mine who researched this subject, he was called Clive Potter, still around, is Clive from the Midlands. His theory was that we're not actually dealing with aliens, it's us, humans from the future. And we've gone down some kind of ecological disaster or genetic cul-de-sac. And we are sending messages back to try and say, it's not too late. These things can be changed. And he said, it's only people who are, in inverted commas, sensitive or inverted commas, psychic, that can pick up these messages. Yeah. It's not for everyone. It's not a radio signal, not a TV show. It's just how they've managed to send these messages back in time. And only certain people can, if you want, tune into it. I'm not saying I agree with that. No. I'm not saying I disagree. But it was just another way of looking at it.
It's a valid analogy, isn't it? Without a doubt. And there's the other part of it. If some other intelligence, for want of a better word, beings did arrive on Putin's within Putin's reach, they would probably be captured if possible and used or tested, or it wouldn't end up nice for these beings, would it?
Well, I'll give you another example. I published a book called UFOs over Romania by a chap called Dr. Dan Farkas. And then I followed it up with a book by Dr. Farkas called Hypercivilizations. His theory, because he asked this question, why do the euphonauts, why do they do such stupid things? Like partaking of information to a fisherman that's of no use, no power, can't do anything with it. What his interpretation was that, yes, we are being visited, but these beings are not thousands of years in advance of us, Paul, possibly millions, even billions of years, that they are so advanced in front of us that we as a species cannot fathom them out. They are there in front of us. And he said, for example, you put a flat screen television in an ant's nest.
Yeah, not going to know what
they'll know it's there. They'll crawl all over it. Some of the, soldier ants might even attack it. But there's never in a zillion years be able to figure out what it is, where it's come from, and what it's supposed to do. And he says, perhaps on a galactic scale, we are the ants.
Yeah.
You know, and so the answer is there in front of us, but we as a species are so dumb that we'll never be able to recognize it.
So in their eyes, if it's the easiest way to say it, even the most intelligent of us are absolutely dumb as a whale omelette, kind of thing. Sorry, Irena, go on.
They may just think we're a chemical reaction, the whole ecology, and we may not be any more interesting than the whales or the ants or anything else too.
That's a good point. And I don't know which one of you said earlier. You said they could be us from the future, and when you said he was shown things from the future, it makes it more plausible, doesn't it?
Well, if you think about it, Paul, if you look at the diversity of life on our planet, the difference that these creatures we share this planet with are, I mean, they are some bizarre looking things on this planet, So, but how is it that when we're allegedly contacted by beings from another planet, they look pretty much like you and I? They're humanoid.
Legs, yeah.
Whereas we look around on Earth and there's some very strange looking creatures that we share the planet with. And not only that, I think the second most intelligent species on this planet is the dolphins. And I think scientists think the dolphins have a rudimentary language. But yet, we can't talk to them.
No.
We can teach them to jump up and catch a fish. But can't say, how you feeling today, Flipper?
No.
How's the wife?
Yeah.
Do you want a different fish tomorrow for your dinner or not? We can't do it. So how will we be expected to communicate with something that is obviously
alien?
If it is alien, and we'll never be able to do it, Paul.
No, I agree. I didn't necessarily mean alien from outer space. It's just totally alien to what me, you, and Irene are as human beings.
Yeah.
So where do you, to both of you, where do you think these things are from then? Do you necessarily think they're from outer space, or could they actually be here within the oceans of the world? I mean, any views?
Well, I took some college courses on quantum theory and mechanics and reality. And there's probably no way you can tell whether your reality is real or whether you're in virtual reality to start with. And with the UAP, like it shows beings walking through walls and all kinds of things that we can't do. But we may just be in some type of reality where it's set up so that we can't do this or that, and we're supposed to figure out what to do. But our own reality may not be real too, and there's no way to find out unless you get outside. And we're not outside; we're in it. So
we're in it, yeah.
Paul, don't ask a scientist a question like that because
Well, all good though. So whilst looking at 1973 or any of your other cases that you've looked in, Irena and Philip, have you found similar sightings around the world? Is there any notable ones where, take Rendlesham Forest, for example, 1980?
Forget
no, we don't have to do Rendlesham Forest, but what I'm saying is, have we looked in other parts of the world to see whether there's been lots of other sightings around that month, around that period of time?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there is a self-made publication I think it's by Walter N. Webb, and it says 1973, the year of the humanoids.
Right.
So there was a huge wave of things across the United States. As Irena's mum phoned her up, and said, "Oh, there's all these UFO sightings," and it's only later. And again in the book, I found a newspaper cutting, and there was one of the main UFO groups at the time is called NICAP, National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomena, and the head of NICAP, can't remember his name. He said, "We've been inundated since the Parker-Hickson event." So the NICAP files are held in Albuquerque with a chap called David Marler at the National UFO Historical Records Center. So I emailed David and explained, and I said, can you just randomly select some reports from NICAP after October the 11th, 1973 that were sent in? Obviously, we can't investigate them. They was just give you so we have one chapter of other stuff that were reported to NICAP, and there is some bizarre things among it, Paul. What you'd see if you look back at ufology in general across the 1970s, it is the decade of high strangeness. It really is. And we don't get necessarily that kind of thing today. I mean, a few years back, somebody interviewed me and said, where have all the Space Brothers gone? Of course, they were the aliens of the 1950s. They've gone. So when you look at the UFO study, we'll take 1947 as a start date to today. Rather than concentrate on any aspect of it or any year or any decade, take a broad look at it and you'll see that it has evolved.
Yeah, without a doubt.
And it's still continuing to evolve. Now, whether that's us as researchers that's shaping that, because you go online now, all they're talking about is, what the government's not going to tell us or tell us about, and it drives you up the wall. Yeah. But there's no actually meat on the bone.
Why do you think it's changed? The descriptions of the objects have changed from the 1940s. Has anybody got, Irena, have you any views on that, Philip?
Well, we'll go right to the start, Paul, right to the modern era of Kenneth Arnold. And of course, after his sighting in Kenneth Lands's airplane, a journalist says to Kenneth, how did these objects move through the sky? And he said, like you skip a saucer on a pond.
Yeah.
And the term flying saucer was born, but they didn't look.
No.
And suddenly, everybody's seeing flying saucers. So,
So do we jump into realms of potential fantasy and say that this is what the beings, the intelligence, is presenting to us because that's what we want it to be, or because they can't all have been seeing flying saucers. Like you said, Kenneth Arnold's, it didn't look like a flying saucer. It just described the motion.
Which came first, Paul, the UFO researcher or the UFOs?
So, have you any views on that, Irena?
Well, some of Kathleen Marden's research shows that often when people have close encounters with UAP, they also experience poltergeist activity or something like that. And that's just as weird as UFOs. And you don't know whether they're related. I mean, they both may be aspects of the same thing. If you see, an orb, you may think, oh, that's a UFO. But it might also be a poltergeist thing. Mm-hmm. And if somebody 2,000 years ago saw it, it might, they'd interpret, different.
Some celestial body or being. Yeah. It's fascinating. So so the poltergeist manifestation or activity after a sighting, or what comes first? As Philip's just said, does the poltergeist activity come first? But do you think that's because we've been heightened and we in our own beings, just like one of you touched on, somebody starts painting, somebody starts writing poetry. So we're more open to the belief that something very strange is around us and is real because we've seen and experienced it. So we start to experience secondary things that aren't necessarily related to what we've actually seen. A lot of bits they're thrown out, but what do you think?
Well, you probably know as well as us, Paul, in your own research, there are areas that you've been investigating, specific geographical areas that have a plethora of paranormal activity. And then, so you say, well, why that area?
Yeah.
And it's a bit of everything. We had the same in parts of the Yorkshire Dales back in the 1980s. And once you start digging, it's not just UFOs, it's a bit of everything. But so is it something to do with the geographical location? I don't know.
I tend to think it is, but it's only my views are just location is key. You'll have heard me saying it before, because like you've just said, and I'm repeating what you've just said, you get like this multi-phenomena events occurring, don't you, in these concentrated areas? But like you just said, I don't know why, and I don't know whether Irena might have a better idea than me. But what are your views on that one?
Well, I think it would be hard to tell a UFO experience, UAP experience from a poltergeist, because, I mean, sometimes they're a lot different, but they're still not in the normal. And they may both be related some way.
Yeah.
I mean, we may just be conscious of the tiniest little bit of our environment. And we may be, connecting with other things that we don't understand, but that affect us, so that we see UAP or poltergeist or whatever. And poltergeist may disguise as UFOs, because we're going now apparently into the universe. And so we're seeing UAPs as spaceships, which just may be our interpretation of something that we don't quite understand.
Yeah, like Dr. Farkas said, we're looking at something and we're so stupid we can't understand it. But as a sentient being, we try and figure it out. And it's one of the things about certain sightings, Paul. People join the dots. That's the way our brain works. It wants a complete picture in front of you, and that leads to perceiving things in certain ways.
Sometimes in ways that you want it to go as well. Not you personally,
absolutely,
but the researcher.
Every one of us on this planet has a belief system, whether we're conscious of it or not. And our belief system will, either consciously or unconsciously, lead to how we interpret and perceive certain things, And that's not just about this subject. It's about a whole range of subjects, from politics to religion, to your favorite sandwich, and it's, so that's why when somebody said, "Oh, I've got this sighting, it's from a pilot. Pilots are human beings and make mistakes and perceive things. They have their own belief system, just like the rest of us. Pilot is not a trained observer. A pilot is there to get that plane from A to B in one piece. You ask any pilot, are you trained in how to observe things as part of your pilot training? The answer will be no. In combat, it's slightly different. But again, they have equipment to do that now. In the old days, we used to have the observer corps, and they could tell what kind of airplane was from the silhouette. Yeah. Those days have gone. Those days have gone. So perception has a lot to do with it, Paul.
Yeah. Irena, you did a lot of work for MUFON, yeah? Yeah. So how did that fit then when MUFON? It's not a trick question towards you either, Irena. I'm just curious because MUFON concentrated on the UFO. Did other elements of unexplained phenomena come in with a report and you thought, not you personally, but MUFON will disregard that because it doesn't fit the criteria that we're looking into?
Well, I was always kind of independent and didn't take everything seriously. So I thought... at first, MUFON was very physical, and that these are
crap
with aliens. I don't know if they're so much that way now, because I think having the government at least address it somewhat scientifically is bringing a lot of people out of the woodwork saying this happened to me, and they're saying ridiculous things that nobody would have believed just a few years ago, that they're probably honestly reporting them. And so
can I just jump in there as well, Paul? Back in the 80s, there was an American abduction researcher. I'm not going to mention him by name, but he was well known. It's not Bud Hopkins.
No.
Well known at the time. And he said that we should dismiss every abduction account if it doesn't have the grey aliens in it. It should be dismissed. Right. So in other words, the only authentic abduction cases must have the little grey guys in it.
They shouldn't have been doing job then.
And I thought, how ridiculous is that? Because if you look at things in the UK, just for example, that's why I wrote the book like I did, to show the difference. And there are some bizarre looking things, you know. And again, if you open your eyes and look around the world, again, there is some bizarre looking things. It's not all the little grey guys.
No, you only want to go into some bars around Bridlington. It's like Star Wars bar. Right, so we'll ask Les, because we've got literally 10 minutes left, so we'll have a few questions if that's possible.
Yeah, and let's have a look. I've got a few questions in, so I'm conscious of the time. We probably can't do some of these questions real justice, but we'll try our best with what I've got in front of me. Paul Thurston is asking, Paul, can you do a video with Philip and Howard Hughes sometime? That would be a cracker.
It would, but I'm pretty sure, and Philip might agree with me, I don't think Howard does any. I have considered asking him because I'm quite good friends with Howard, so it would be a cracker, yeah.
I'm sure we'll persuade him at some point, Paul. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I have a reason for saying that, but we'll leave it there.
Okay, sounds good.
And
thanks for the question.
A good supporter of the show, Lee Roscoe, is a question for Philip. What does Philip think about the top secret Nazi UFO leak videos which keep popping up? Have you seen any of those, Philip?
Yeah, absolutely. I think every single one of them's fake. Simple as that. The Nazis were clever people, but they weren't as clever as they claimed to be. You have to remember Joseph Goebbels was their propaganda guy, and he was an expert at it. And so it's like the Soviet space program. The Soviets had the Americans convinced that they were actually in the lead in the space race, when in fact they weren't. So their technology wasn't as good as they claimed it to be, and same with the Nazis. I'm sorry.
No, good answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I've got a good question here actually from Andy Decodes. Why do some witnesses see different things during an encounter? Excellent question.
Yeah, good question. Very good question. Irena, any thoughts on that?
Well, one thing obvious is holograms. If you use a laser and shoot a hologram, if you're in a different position, you may see something different. And maybe some UFOs are holograms, but at other times it may be something projected into the mind. And I know a lot of people, they'll be with somebody and they'll see something, but the other person right beside them doesn't, or sees something different. And in one of my books, I went into a whole lot of detail where one person saw little globules and the other person saw all kinds of beings walking around there both at the same time. And some of that is probably because there's some way of projecting something into people's minds.
Well, of course, that's what John Burroughs of Rendlesham fame claims. Because if you take Mr. Burroughs and Penniston claims, not Burroughs, they were the two guys who went into Rendlesham Forest that night in 1980. And they were stood yards apart, literally a few yards apart. Jim Penniston says he saw a triangular-shaped craft, either hovering or just off the ground, about the size of a large car. Blue lights underneath, red lights on top. It touched it and it was smooth. Saw these markings on the side of it. His colleague, John Burroughs, he stood a few yards away and said, I never saw any of that. I just saw some strange lights.
Yeah.
It's a very curious thing. There is a long possible explanation for that we don't have time for now. Right?
Just briefly, it could also be an age and a culture thing, whereas, I don't know, some younger people might see what we perceive as aliens, and somebody of later years might see aliens. See angels. Religious background, perception.
Human perception and belief systems. You'll see a phenomena and you interpret it with your own belief system and your own perception.
Your own belief system. Better put than me, that, Philip. Thank you.
One witness who saw something with her sister said that it was because some people are more open to the experience than others. And so they were saying, same place, saw something different. And she thought, well, she was more open than her sister.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Alison Buttle there, Philip.
Yeah. I mean, the Pascagoula case is the most fascinating event I've ever got involved in. However, back in the UK, rather than one event, it was the incidents in and around Carlton Moor near Skipton in the Yorkshire Dales. We had literally everything reported in this small geographical area in the early to mid 1980s. Why? I have no idea. You know, it's semi-rural, as we would say today. You know, there ain't any buildings there. There's nothing. You know, and that one area still on my mind today. You know, so
do you think it's still active?
More near Skipton in the Yorkshire Dales. Who knows, Paul? I honestly don't know. I would like to think so, but I honestly don't know.
Okay.
I've got a question. Then we informed people earlier on in the show, but if you can remind people, Philip, UFO Notice asking where can we purchase
the book?
Yeah, Paul's open to offers for the one he's got there.
Yes, I will show you this one.
Because he's read it now, so he's, you know.
Yeah, you know, look at that. It's a great body of work. That, you know, it's fabulous.
Before the cameras worked, that was actually under his wonky table leg, stopping it from rocking.
Yeah, just hold it piano up.
But no, all our books are on Amazon. All the different varieties are all on Amazon, and it's print on demand. It's the way we work. They can be, you know, made available to pretty much anywhere in the world in that respect.
Okay, thanks for that. And Ronald Booth, did Charlie have any prior experiences? Pascagoula?
Yeah, he had two as a young fella, as did Calvin. They weren't connected, and we published them in one of our earlier books, because what we found was, during our research, is another aspect that just cropped up. Calvin told us he went under hypnosis by Bud Hopkins in 1993. All of Bud's archive is with Dr. David Jacobs, because Bud's no longer with us. Contacted David Jacobs, he found the tape, made us a copy. And we also found out that Charlie Hickson had gone under regressive hypnosis twice with Bud Hopkins in the 1980s, one in 1985, one in 1989. So there's two tapes. The first tape is details of the first two encounters that Charlie had as a young fella. And we've published all them in previous. I'm in discussions now with how to make these tapes and various audios available in full. So that's something that's ongoing.
Excellent. Have we time for any more, Les?
Yeah, we'll probably get right. Let's have a look. Gillian Stapleton, thanks for the question, Gillian.
Do you think that the beings have succeeded in producing children who can walk among us undetected, as Mr. Blair said?
That's a good question. You know, I look at my grandchildren sometimes and I wonder, you know, I really do. But who knows, mate? That's a question that I can't answer.
I wish we'd more time, because it leads to a brilliant question, Les, that we could have. Have you ever personally been contacted by anyone who claims that they've met beings that are walking amongst us? We ain't got time. I realise that, but yeah. Anyway, one last.
So let's have a look. Let's have a look. I'm just going to put this one on.
I think so, but I can't remember right now.
Yeah.
Nathaniel Gillis, a great friend of Truth Proof Show. Yeah. Thanks if you're still with us, Nathaniel. Do the guests believe we can trust these beings? And that'll be our final question for tonight.
Well, you know, I've spoken to a number of abductees in different parts of the world. And at the end of the day, I've said to them, have you come to any real physical harm? The answer is no. You know, and I had one lady who had repeated experiences, and she just learned to accept that this happens. You know, I'm fine the next day. You know, I go about my daily tasks. So be it. You know, so.
What's your views on that, Eileen?
Bud Hopkins was one of the main researchers. He believed they were benevolent, you know, here to help or here for a good cause. Dr. David Jacobs was of the other opinion, that they're not here to help at all. So, you know, just make up your own mind, really.
Well, I'm a Dr. Jacobs camp, but that's only my opinion. Eileen, have you any views on that before we close it down?
One word, Irena. That's all I can do.
Well, I think one thing it does to people is make them more open-minded. I mean, you know, people that have experience are going to be a lot more open-minded than somebody that is hardcore scientific and doesn't think they exist. But I don't know otherwise.
Well, thank you.
Okay,
And I just want to say, I've just seen my daughter in there, Laura. So hi, Laura, and thanks for everybody. Deb Shaw, everybody.
Yeah.
And Nathaniel Gillis, what last question?
On that note, thank you very much for joining us tonight, Irena and Philip. Absolutely enthralling show. Do you agree, Paul?
Oh, absolutely brilliant. Yeah, and thanks to everybody that's contributed. Thanks for support, guys.
Well, we may come back to you later in the year when the documentary's out, and then maybe you'll be able to get a view of it. Good luck with Wolflands. I think it is excellent. You know, I'll give you my comments on it, and I wish you every success with it. I really do.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Philip.
Thank
Irena,
you.
it's been wonderful talking to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
So
Philip,
on that note, it's
Good luck.
good. Yeah, and just one quick one. Have we got any confirmation on next week's guest, Paul?
We haven't, and I've tried, but it's looking like it's going to be a ghostly one next weekend, guys. So we'll have the Revenant back, and we've got someone else lined up, and we're just going to go into the realms of ghosts.
So
there you
on
go.
that note, we will say good night. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Irena. Thanks, Philip. Bye-bye.